In March and April, I made 2 episodes of something that I called Leftist Lunacy over 9000, and after those, some of you suggested that I should make it a somewhat regular series, just like Research and Analysis, Bad Ideas, or the Feel Good Mythology series. Thing is, I cannot, at least not yet, promise to even try to get the time for such an endeavor. However, I can make this more often, at least once in 6 weeks or something. So I'm going to call this Periodic Insanity and consider it as a continuation to the Leftist Lunacy over 9000 series, and we'll see how it goes. Anyway, with this announcement out of the way, let's dive into the insanity. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so we have 4 stories for this video and the goal to make this video shorter than 45 minutes. That's not an easy task to be sure. Anyway, let's start with the first one, coming from Quartz. The lasting impact of white teachers who mispronounce minority student names. Now let's read a bit before commenting. It's a long one, so I won't read all of it. Quote, taking the attendance at the beginning of class may seem a routine, if not a mundane task to many educators. But to students, their name can be a powerful link to their identity. Pronouncing students' names correctly during attendance, a classroom activity, or any other time of the school day should always be a priority for any classroom teacher. Names hold ancestral and historical significance for many minority, immigrant, and English learning students. Names bring stories which students are often forced to adapt to an Americanized context. That transition, however, is often painful and forces many students to take on a name that is not their own. Yi Wan was only 17 years old when she moved to the United States from mainland China. After enrolling in the bilingual program at her school, she was faced with the overwhelming and unfair decision over whether she would keep her native name or change it to something more Americanized. Why? So that educators would not struggle over the pronunciation. Wan later realized that she had no choice but to take up the name her ESL teacher thought suited her. Her new name would be Winnie. Years later, Wan sits as the current president of the National Association for Bilingual Education, and her personal experiences became the impetus for a campaign launched this year to spotlight the importance of student names. A collaboration between the Santa Clara County Office of Education and NABE, My Name, My Identity, is calling attention to the potential negative effects of a mispronounced name and the ways schools and communities can diffuse the problem. I mean, you what, mate? I mean, seriously? I mean, it is a bit surprising that they found a Chinese individual to be upset about this, because my experience with the Chinese is radically opposite to this. Namely that they expect us to mispronounce their names and they come up themselves with a more European-sounding name to ease up the interaction with everyone else. For instance, I personally was involved in an educational project roughly 4 years ago, and we had a Chinese educator amongst the foreigners who were part of it. The Chinese chap had a rather uncomplicated name, for a Chinese that is, and almost everyone was already able to pronounce it the first time they heard it. Now, nevertheless, he immediately added, after he introduced himself, that we can all call him Robin. In his words, I'm not in China, so it is my job to adapt, not everyone else's, and besides, Robin is easier to remember than my original Chinese name, close quote. And you know what? He was right. I mean, today, 4 years later, only myself and another woman still remember the guy's actual name, while everyone else remembers his face and his name as Robin the Chinese chap. And mind you, there wasn't a single trace of disrespect. Robin is a very smart guy, a staunch capitalist, a big supporter of anything that undermines communism worldwide, and generally a highly pleasant individual. But you see, perhaps that's the thing. Precisely because he's not a leftist, he's willing to accept that the world doesn't revolve around himself and that no, the rest of the planet is not mandated to learn Chinese pronunciation. Besides, the Quartz article chose this individual whose name is Yi Wan, which is aimed to suggest that it's mean to refuse to attempt to correctly pronounce it. But most cases aren't even that obvious. What if the minority student name is Grzegorz Brzęczyszkiewicz? I mean, what then? Or maybe it's Chuitel Ejiofor. What I'm trying to say here is that there are names that are objectively difficult to pronounce depending on where you are in the world. The name John Smith is almost impossible to pronounce if you are in Far Eastern Russia or in China. My own surname, Vulsan, is almost never correctly pronounced outside of the Southern and Eastern Europe. I mean, if I'm in Estonia or Finland, I can expect my name to be pronounced correctly. But if I'm in the Netherlands or Britain, I can safely bet that my name will be mispronounced 100% of the time. And so what? But the thing is that this article doesn't even consider that maybe, just maybe, it's because some names are objectively hard to pronounce. No. In these guys' mind, it's an act of bigotry. Not knowing the rules of pronunciation of most languages on earth is bigotry. Quote, mispronouncing a student's name truly negates his or her identity, which in turn can hinder academic progress, says Won, who also serves as Director of Multilingual Education Services at SCCOE. Overlooking or downplaying the significance of getting a name right, explains Rita Coley, Assistant Professor of Education at the University of California at Riverside, is one of those microaggressions that can emerge in a classroom and seriously undermine learning. Names have incredible significance to families with so much thought, meaning, and culture woven into them, Coley says. When the child enters school and teachers, consciously or not, mispronounce, disregard, or change the name, they are, in a sense, disregarding the family and culture of the students as well. A tiny act of bigotry is how former teacher and education blogger Jennifer Gonzalez succinctly put it into 2014. In a post titled How We Pronounce Students' Names and Why It Matters, Gonzalez wrote, quote, whether you intend to or not, what you're communicating is this. Your name is different, foreign, and weird. It's not worth my time to get it right. I mean, has anyone considered that maybe the message is correct? That maybe, just maybe, your name is indeed foreign, weird, and objectively not worth my time to get it right? I mean, serious question. Also, foreign is an objective term, not a subjective one. Someone is objectively foreign, and his or her name is objectively foreign. And there's nothing wrong with being a foreigner. In fact, in the recent past, naturalized immigrants all over the place used to change their name to blend in with their new home society. And that was great. I mean, it's still practiced in some parts of the world. I know I would change my name, or at least the spelling of it, to suit the needs of the adopting society if I were to ever permanently emigrate. I mean, why not? It would be my duty to adapt to them, and most definitely not their duty to adapt to me. Yet for some reason, this very commonsensical rationale has been turned on its head. Quote, the effects can be long-lasting. In 2012, Coley and Daniel Solorzano examined the issue in a study called Teachers, Please Learn Our Names, Racial Microaggressions and the K-12 Classrooms. They found that the failure to pronounce a name correctly impacts the worldview and social-emotional well-being of students, which of course is linked to learning. Students often felt shame, embarrassment, and that their name was a burden, Coley says. They often began to shy away from their language, culture, and families. Coley points out that most educators are not doing so out of disrespect, but tend to be confined by a monocultural viewpoint that makes it more challenging to center cultures outside of their own. Consequently, certain names sound unfamiliar and fall far outside their comfort zone. Yeah, well, so what? I mean, why should anyone center to himself or herself cultures outside of his own while being in his own nation in an institution of his own nation? I mean, that's just insane. Besides, is this expectation universal or is it only for Westerners? Because I somehow doubt that these concerns are on anyone's radar in South Korea or in Japan or in South Africa or in Turkey. I mean, there are many pupils from Kazakhstan studying in South Korea. Do you think the South Korean educators are willing to give the time of the day on how to correctly pronounce Kazakh names? Or the educators in Turkey spend any second thinking on how to pronounce Persian or Kurdish names? Just think about that. It's almost always on Europeans and North Americans the burden to adapt their entire workload to foreigners. Alright, enough with this nonsense. Let's get to the second story. Coming from Breitbart, California State University to introduce segregating housing for black students. I mean, this is fun. Quote, California State University has announced that it will provide segregated housing for the university's black students in an attempt to provide them with a safe space. Black students will have the option to move into a residential complex solely for African Americans. The decision to provide segregated accommodations comes just 9 months after the university's Black Student Union presented a list of demands to the university's authorities to challenge what they perceived as an endemic racial discrimination. Their demands included a $30 million endowment to support black students financially, an anti-discrimination policy combined with cultural competency training, compulsory ethnic studies courses for first and second year students, editors of Breitbart are having a vacation, as well as segregated housing for black students. Segregated housing would provide a cheaper alternative housing solution for black students. This space would also serve as a safe space for black CSLA students to congregate, connect, and learn from each other, the letter read. Although the university failed to meet all their demands, they have agreed to provide a segregated accommodation known as the Halisi Scholars Black Living Learning Community. Cal State ALA spokesman Robert Lopez told the College Fix in an email that the residents would focus on academic excellence and learning experiences that are inclusive and non-discriminatory. The Black Student Union, which is also known as the African Black Coalition, celebrated the decision on its Instagram page, saying that the segregation was long overdue but well-deserved, as well as adding information for students on how to apply. Now question. Is this segregated housing for all blacks or only for African Americans? Because I presume that Cal State has students who are Negroid but not African Americans. Now I'd be surprised if that weren't the case. And believe it or not, and I know this is a hard one to swallow for progressives, but not all Negroes are African Americans. Or put it another way, not all very dark-skinned people subscribe to the same culture that the very dark-skinned people born and raised in the US are allegedly subscribing. And I say allegedly because even I know that a significant chunk of Negroes in the United States don't subscribe to the so-called black culture and tend to have similar opinions with mine about Black Lives Matter and other forms of progressive-inspired racist agitprop degeneracy. But even if we put that aside and assume that all Negroes born and raised in the United States that attend to Cal State do subscribe to the progressive racist vision of being black, that still leaves out quite a few people in the campus. Would the safe space apply to those too? And if yes, how will the frail hearts of the Black Student Union react when they'll be confronted with non-racist and non-communist thought right in the middle of their safe space? Will they file a complaint with the, ironically, overwhelmingly white administration that these said individuals are not black enough and thus should be excluded from the from the segregated housing? I mean, I'm laughing now, but this is a serious question. Now, As I said in my video last year about discrimination, I personally do not have anything against segregation per se, just with state-sponsored mandatory segregation. In other words, if one wants to exclude certain people from his or her own private house or business, one must be free to do so, regardless of the grounds chosen for that exclusion. In plain English, I do support the existence of organizations such as Black Student Union and their right to exclude non-blacks from their own legitimately operated and owned premises. By the same token, I do of course support the existence of white-only spaces, Chinese-only spaces, women-only, men-only, and everything you can possibly imagine. As long as it's voluntary and not using state coercion in any way, I'm fine with it. Knock your heads off. But that's not what Cal State is doing, isn't it? I mean, Cal State is partly funded by money taken at gunpoint from all people. Using that money to provide racially segregated housing only for one group is not something that anyone should ever consider supporting. Now, there are two ways to get out from this conundrum. Either open the possibility for everyone to segregate themselves however they deem fit, or shut down this black segregated thingy immediately. Now, I, of course, would rather see the latter instead of the former, because it is not, nor should it ever be, the place of state-funded institutions to kowtow to any kind of segregationist leanings. What is funny about this story is that the Black Student Union has an impeccably identical discourse with the other racist Democrat-funded organization, the KKK. I mean, I guess I have to give it to the Democrats. They managed to convince everyone that they're now anti-racist and at the same time convince significant numbers of Negroes to adopt and apply to themselves the standards of the KKK. I mean, that's quite a remarkable achievement in terms of racist agitprop. And I'm not even joking. I mean, think about it. From the civil rights movement and the End Segregation Now shouts to the cries of integration at all costs by activist Democrat judges, now 40 to 50 years later, legitimately black organizations cry segregation now and the hell with integration. I mean, going full circle like this whilst part of the same umbrella, namely the Democrat Party, is really astonishing. And I say that in all honesty. This is an aspect to which the left has always been good at. This kind of propaganda is very hard to produce and, once again, the left proves its qualities. Amazing! Alright, enough with the racist insanities, let's get to the other pet project of the left, gender insanity. Now, two stories on this topic. The first one is a video published by the University College London promoting the campaign They for Them. Now let's watch a bit, shall we?
It's really funny when you have to think about, you know, things like what is a pronoun, because it's something that's so basic and it's so everyday that you often forget what it actually means.
Oh, so it's a campaign about pronouns. This is good, carry on.
A pronoun is something that you use to refer to someone else that isn't their name.
Okay, we know what a pronoun is, but please tell us how it's used and why you're so special.
We use pronouns to indicate our identity and how we identify as people.
The most common gender-specific pronouns are he and she, which indicates that a person identifies as male and female.
But that's not always the case. Some men and some women might not use he or she respectively, and some people who use he or she might be different genders.
Alright, so some people are weirdos. So what?
There are also gender-neutral pronouns, such as they and ze, which indicates that a person identifies as either a gender or somewhere along the gender spectrum.
So why are pronouns so important? Well, we use them in everyday life, in everyday conversation all the time, so it's very easy to overlook why it's something that needs to be pointed out.
Alright, we're getting nowhere. Tell us why we should give a toss about this, and why and how should we pervert our everyday language to suit your degenerate needs.
Pronouns are a very important and integral part of an individual's identity. It's something most people don't ever have to think about and take for granted.
So, if most people don't even have to think about it, then again, why should we care? Most people don't have paranoid schizophrenia either, yet I don't see schizophrenics launching campaigns to raise awareness on how it is to speak with imaginary characters that only schizophrenics see individually. So again, why should we care?
It's important to get pronouns right because every day people who are in the LGBT community deal with different discriminations and different ways of how they identify and often misgendered or not represented in the right way.
Alright, but then again, people in the schizophrenic community deal every day with being misrepresented as lunatics and mischaracterized, and also with discrimination, such as nobody employing them as waiters, for instance, since nobody would want the waiter or the waitress to serve food to an imaginary person. Yet for some reason, your particular disorder must get special consideration. Again, why?
If you use the right one, it will make someone feel really good because you're accepting who they are as a person.
Oh, so it's about feeling good about yourself. That's a fantastic goal, especially in early childhood education. But you guys seem to be adults, not daycare children. I mean, don't get me wrong, I like feeling good about myself too, but I'm also an adult, and as any responsible and mature adult, I do understand that it is not, nor should it ever be, the duty of the rest of the people to make sure that I feel good about myself. My feelings are my responsibility. So why shouldn't your feelings be your individual responsibility?
If you misuse pronouns for someone, you're effectively thrusting upon them with an identity that they themselves do not have.
Yeah, so why should I care? For instance, when I'm abroad and someone hears me speaking Romanian over the phone, depending on which part of the Romanian lexicon I'm using, the generally Latin or the generally Slavic, which in turn is dependent on the topic I'm discussing, the foreigner almost always assumes that I'm either a Spaniard or a Slovenian. I mean, don't ask me why, but apparently colloquial Romanian language is easy to be confused either with Spanish or Slovenian depending on the topic. Though, admittedly, some people confuse it with Italian, which is a much more accurate confusion, so to speak, since Romanian is basically Italian with a slightly more complex grammar and a weirder pronunciation. The point I'm trying to make is that when I'm asked, where exactly from Spain are you, I'm basically being foisted upon an identity which I don't have. Yet, you know what I do when that happens? I shrug it off, because it's not the business of everyone else to know things about me. In fact, I prefer most people not to know too many things about me. Now here's another, more common example. When I don't have to use computers or have to read something, I don't wear my glasses because I don't exactly need them and they don't improve my sight in any way when I'm on the street or at a bar or at a meeting of some sorts. That means most people don't get to see me with glasses, hence they assume that my sight is as good as theirs. So if an unplanned situation emerges when I have to read something or use a piece of technology, I usually force myself to do it without the glasses, which is not recommended, but it works, and if it's too hard, I simply excuse myself out from the situation for the reason that I don't have the glasses with me. But that's because I'm not a progressive. If I had been a progressive, I would have gone full Macintosh on everyone else for daring to deny my disability and foisting upon me an able-bodied normative situation, thus exercising their privilege. I mean, thank goodness I'm not insane, but most college students indeed are. And I gave these two examples in order to make 2 points. In the Spaniard example, I wanted to show that most people are not ill-intended, and in the sight example, I wanted to show just how insane it would be for me to take offense at being presumed to have a correct sight. And these 2 examples fit impeccably with those who bitch and moan and complain about my pronouns. They either have a mental disorder that they should absolutely not be proud of, or they're simply being silly and proud of it. Because, mind you, most of those who claim to be genderqueer are basically butch lesbian women with a chip on their shoulder and with an axe to grind on normal people. Don't believe me? Let's listen to their solution to the alleged pronoun problem.
How can we respect other people's pronouns? Well, what you can do is listen when they tell you about what pronouns they use. When they tell you which pronouns they use, then just use them in everyday life. And make sure if they change which pronouns they're using, then make sure you change to use those new ones.
Okay, so the first solution is listen, believe, and obey. That's even worse than most mental disorders, or disorders in general, because when I tell you that I can't see properly to read this text, it's the case all the time. It was the case throughout my existence and will continue to be the case till either I die or technology evolves enough to correct it, which is highly unlikely anyway. But with these people, what they say may be true today, but not tomorrow. It is inherently a sign of mental disorder to claim that not only you can fundamentally change your sexual identity, but you can also change it multiple times a year, or multiple times a day. The solution for these people may lie in psychiatric treatment and not in campaigns to encourage their delusions. But anyway, let's hear these magnificent students, the alleged future elites of their nations and our societies, God help us. Let's hear their most important solution.
A good way to respect people's pronouns is to use gender-neutral pronouns to start with, and then when they tell you their preferred pronoun, continue to use that pronoun from then on out. It's a good way to show respect, to show that you listen to the person, to show that you respect their identity, and show that you care about how they feel and how you want to make them feel comfortable, as well as adjusting their settings and making them feel comfortable to you.
Jesus Christ. So, basically, we must all, the 99.97% of the populace, the normal and normative majority of us, fundamentally transform our way of being just for the infinitesimal chance of encountering a tranny weirdo who might be triggered at being misgendered. I mean, really? How about no? How about we all continue doing what we do and weirdos continue do what they do, and then when push comes to shove, weirdos adapt to normal people rather than the other way around? Because you see, there are things that are immutable, such as the fact that there are only men and women out there. Everything else is disorder. Either physiological disorder, such as the 0.05% top of the populace that is intersex, or mental disorder, such as the 0.5 to 0.8 of the populace that suffers from gender identity disorder as per the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. In other words, it's called a disorder because it is not orderly. And orderly is, and should always be, the tendency. Now, I'm not saying that everything disorderly should be banned, but I am saying that when in public, most things disorderly should be avoided if possible. And it's not an unreasonable request. There are many things that are disorderly, and we know they occur, yet we keep them out from the public space. For instance, the fact that sadomasochism exists. It is a disorderly behavior that it is not illegal since it doesn't harm unconsenting adults. Nevertheless, it is a behavior that is purposefully kept outside of the public arena precisely because it is generally understood, including by most members of the BDSM community, that the behavior itself is not something that the general public needs to know or see. And mind you, the propensity towards being turned on by brutal acts of sexual connotation is much more likely to be innate and immutable than the propensity towards thinking that you are the opposite sex. Same goes for a plethora of other behaviors, some treatable, some untreatable. They are and should always be legal if they don't harm anyone, but should also be kept highly outside of the public arena, both for the sake of its practitioners and for the sake of the rest of the public. What should definitely never happen is to attempt to normalize them and, more importantly, force everyone else to adapt fundamental behaviors of their own to the disorderly behaviors of a minuscule minority. Now, I do realize that this may sound mean, but that's how civilizations work. I mean, think about it this way. There are more native speakers of Swahili in the United States than there are transgenders. I mean, roughly 1 in 7,000 residents of the United States aged 5 or older speaks Swahili at home. Now, that's a lot more than 1 in 63,800 residents who say they are transgender, or 0.23% of the populace. So imagine if you'd be asked to learn Swahili so you won't offend with your native English speaker privilege the eventual Swahili speakers you might encounter. If you accept the tranny narrative, then you must accept my Swahili example. After all, you're 8 to 9 times more likely to meet a native Swahili speaker than a tranny. Just saying. This is madness. Alright. Let's get to our last story for this episode, also from the Gender Insanity Project. Coming from campusreform.org, tampons coming to men's rooms at Brown University. And goes like this, quote, Brown University's student body president will be hand-delivering menstrual products to all non-residential bathrooms on campus, including men's rooms, with the help of 20 other students. Viet Nguyen, president of the Undergraduate Council of Students, announced the initiative in a campus-wide email Tuesday, saying he wants to communicate the message that not all people who menstruate are women, according to Newsweek. There's been a lot of conversation about why pads and tampons are a necessity, not a luxury, but not a lot of action. We wanted to take it into our own hands, Nguyen explains in the email, observing that low-income students struggle with having the necessary funding for food, let alone tampons. By putting menstrual products in women's, men's, and gender-inclusive bathrooms, Nguyen aims to set a tone of trans inclusivity and not forget that they're an important part of the population. But is under no illusions that the effort will be universally popular. I'd be naive to say that there won't be pushback, he preemptively concedes. I've had questions about why we're implementing this in male bathrooms as well. It's an initial confusion, but people generally understand when we explain it. Nguyen told Newsweek that menstrual products will be available in approximately 30 to 40 bathrooms across campus for the 2016-2017 school year, financed exclusively by the Undergraduate Finance Board rather than general university funds. Why are these products treated the same way as other products we hand out like toilet paper, he pondered in an interview with The Guardian. It's a necessity rather than a luxury, so Brown and other universities should treat them as such. It's amazing. So, again, considering that roughly 1 in 63,000 people in the United States are tranny weirdo, and considering that 2/3 of them are so-called male to female, hence no need for tampons, it is safe to assume that placing tampons in men's rooms is anti-economic and downright retarded, even if we are to take it for granted that transgenderism is something to be celebrated and included in all walks of life. I mean, how many transgender students that need tampons can be at the Brown University? I mean, there are no more than 9,000 students at this institution. So there's a huge chance that there are exactly 0 such students at this institution, and a reasonable chance that there are no more than 1, maybe 2, and that is me being charitable. Now, question, how will such a fuss help those trannies? Question number 2, would they be better served by making a fuss about their condition or by an administration that minds its own bloody business? Because make no mistake, trannies don't suffer from all mental disorders combined, they just suffer from one. Which means that otherwise then they tend to be like most people. namely individuals who tend to want to be left alone and who nod along to get along rather than throwing tantrums all over the place. Anyway, let's read one more paragraph. Quote, feminine hygiene products are not a luxury. They're as essential as toilet paper, just as anyone who has ever struggled to obtain or afford them, agreed Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women. Students' participation in school should not be hindered by insufficient access to this basic necessity. Universities around the country should follow suit. Really? Well, I have struggled to obtain toilet paper. You know what I did then? I used a newspaper. A left-wing newspaper, to be more precise. Now, who is to say that leftist propaganda is completely useless and doesn't help the poor? It sure did help me wipe my arse. But in any event, to claim that tampons are just as necessary as toilet paper is to be completely unreasonable. I mean, tampons are needed by women between the ages of 12 and 50, which means 28 to 34% of the total population. Toilet paper is needed by people between the ages of 0 and 120, with the possible exception of some of those on life support, which means between 99.98% and 99.99% of the total population. Heck, in some areas, such as Austria for instance, there are, at any moment in time, more people who need a cigarette than people who need tampons. So no, tampons are not an equal necessity to toilet paper. Never have been and never will be. Now, the very disturbing part of this story is the highly irresponsible way in which the students' tuition shekels are being used. Over the long run, this stunt is meant to create a further expectation of dependency amongst the impressionable minds that tend to exist in a university. I mean, you have to understand that the ideal of most of these young folks is to have a government that gives them everything without even considering the fact that the government that can give you everything can also take away everything from you. I mean, this is how civilizations fall. Right before they fall, they get concerned with most trivial nonsense imaginable and open the floodgates to everyone willing to go in and put it out of its misery, because they lose sight of their survival and the desire to survive. And when that happens, make sure you can survive individually. I mean, I've spoken about this in this video called The Thin Layer of Civilization. I mean, this is not a joke. I mean, I'm being dead serious when I say that concerning oneself with proper pronouns or spending other people's shekels to put tampons in men's rooms is a good sign of civilizational collapse. And when that kind of stupidity becomes normative, and it is very close to becoming one, unless some dramatical shift occurs by the end of this decade, so once that kind of stupidity becomes settled and normative, the only thing left for the remaining normal people is to get ready for the collapse, because it's going to be quite a bumpy ride. But then again, you can also hope that I'm being wrong. Heck, I hope that I'm wrong, because I'd rather run my business and do videos in my spare time whilst traveling than going back to working days on end just so I won't die of starvation. So I don't have a vested interest in civilizational collapse, but the leftists do, and that's why we're here, to do our part in preventing that. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching and bearing with the insanity delivered. Thank you all for financing and subscribing to this channel, and I'll see you soon on Freedom Alternative.